Assistance Research Associates under contract to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. My name is Pam Hine, a Senior Project Associate with the SAMHSA SOAR TA Center, and I'll be moderating today's event. Before we officially begin the webinar, I'd like to present Kristen Lupfer, our Project Director here at the SOAR TA Center, who will give our welcome this afternoon. Kristen?
I want to provide a special welcome to our participants on today's webinar. I know that we have great representation from the SOAR community and that we're welcoming our friends from Healthcare for the Homeless programs and veteran-serving organizations. We had an incredible response and interest to this topic and for this webinar, which confirms what we assumed about both the need for this special and vulnerable population and the need for quality information regarding the significant impact that these injuries can have on individuals' lives and their ability to work. When we hear about traumatic brain injuries in the media, we get conflicting and confusing information. Today is to help clarify the facts and identify concrete strategies that providers can implement to help people who have experienced a traumatic brain injury to access the services and treatment they need, and specifically to document the relevant medical and functional impairment for the disability application. We all are so fortunate to have an incredible panel of experts today to share this information with you. So I won't delay any longer, and I'll turn it back over to Pam.
For your welcome. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for download on the SOAR website in about a week. Your lines will be muted throughout the webinar. Right now, you may download the PowerPoint slides. You have two options. First, if you look at the top left of your screen, you will see the File icon. After you hit File, you'll see Save and then Document. You'll click Document to download the PowerPoint materials. This option is to visit the SOAR website. Click on Webinar, find today's topic, and you'll be able to download and print the PowerPoint slides, and also an assessment tool we have up there as well. At the conclusion of the webinar, you'll be directed to a link for an online evaluation. We value and appreciate your feedback and use it to improve and inform future SOAR webinars and activities. So we ask that you take a moment to complete it immediately following the webinar, and we thank you for doing that. So let's briefly review our learning objectives and the agenda for today's webinar. As Kristen mentioned in her welcome, we are honored and fortunate to have three distinguished panelists on today's webinar. First, Stacia Edmonston. Stacia has worked in the field of brain injury rehabilitation since 1983. Since September of 2012, she served as the Traumatic Brain Injury Person-Centered Planning Trainer at the Maryland Behavioral Health Administration. Next, E. Caroline Mason, Medical Relations Director with the Maryland Disability Determination Services, better known as DDS, in Timonium, Maryland, will share DDS's perspective. And rounding out the presentation, we are lucky to have with us Dr. Carla Sarno, MD, who is the Chief Psychiatric Consultant with the Maryland DDS as well. Back to the learning objectives very briefly. So after you complete today's webinar, you'll have a better understanding of the prevalence and causes of traumatic brain injury among not only veterans, but also other individuals that you serve who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. You'll also better understand the challenges when interviewing SOAR applicants with a TBI diagnosis. You'll learn through the sharing of practice tips, and you'll learn about a new assessment tool that's been very helpful to overcome some of these challenges. And from DDS, you'll learn major methods for evaluating a TBI and the evidence required to evaluate and analyze a claim involving TBI. Before we begin the webinar, we would like to do our first poll question. And I'm trying to pull up the poll question. Bear with me 1 minute. There we go. Poll question number 1. We'd like to gauge your familiarity with traumatic brain injury and medical impairment. So the poll asks, how familiar are you with a TBI impairment? The answer that really best fits your understanding. And we'll open that poll and take a minute to be able to get your responses. So for folks that are not familiar at all with TBI, the signs and symptoms and functional limitations, please pick that one. If you have just a basic understanding of the diagnosis, but really not sure how DS evaluates it, choose that one. If you understand very basically, you have a basic understanding of TBI, signs and symptoms, and related functional limitations, and you know how DDS evaluates, pick that one. And then you have a good understanding of TBI and also success with representing applicants with a TBI diagnosis, please pick that one. This will not only help us, but the presenters to know really what part of their presentations they should hone in on. So take them to give us your responses. Well, we can see from the responses, most of you are not familiar with TBI, many of you, but we do have 243 of folks are participating that have a basic understanding, but really don't know how DDS does evaluate. So our folks at DDS will be sure to highlight how to evaluate a TBI. Again for participating in our poll. So without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over to Stacia, who will begin her presentation. Stacia? Stacia, you're ready to begin your presentation. Make your phone. Yeah. Unmute, that would be *66 or the icon on WebEx. Hi, Stacia. Are you on the line? Reason we've lost audio with Stacia. So what we'll do now is we'll hand it over to DDS representative, Caroline Mason and Dr. Carla Sarno. Advance the slides to your presentation. Okay, I have your slides pulled up. If you'd like to,
do you advance to my starting point?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caroline Mason, and I am, as Pam introduced, the Medical Relations Director here at the Maryland DDS. Our agency, the Maryland DDS, administers Social Security Administration's disability program for the citizens of the state of Maryland. We are tasked with adjudicating claims for the citizens, and our main goal is to gather and develop information to make a medical determination as to whether an individual is disabled or blind. Part of the information that we gather is medical as well as vocational, educational, and functional documentation. We're going to really talk a lot today about how we evaluate medically traumatic brain injury, and we're going to also try to touch on the functional aspect. Our objectives this afternoon are to share information about the disability program, and we're going to include information about the definition of disability. We're going to discuss our sequential evaluation process. We're going to talk a little bit about our medical listings we use to adjudicate specifically traumatic brain injuries. The listings are they're much larger and encompass a lot of other medical conditions, but our goal today is to talk about neurological, and then from the mental side, specifically cognitively, how that's impacted. We're also going to talk about, Carla, our chief psychiatrist here, will talk about TBI symptoms, cause of TBI, changes associated with TBI. As mentioned, Carla will be presenting, with me today, and although we both work for the Maryland Disability Determination Services, the information that we're discussing today, knowing that this is a national webinar, this is not specific to the Maryland DDS. Although we adjudicate claims here, it's a national program, and this is how all state agencies operate, the definitions, the listings, our sequential evaluation. So this information will hopefully help everyone that's on the call this afternoon. And it's really nice to see the high volume of folks that are on this call today. To start off, the poll was really great. It gave us, both myself and Carla, an idea of how many people may not be familiar with everything that we do here at the DDS. And it's nice to know that, because I didn't want to quickly scan over something that might be important. So our Social Security definition of disability, there are three key points that are part of this definition. Inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity by reason of any medically determinable physical or mental impairment that can be expected to result in death, or that has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. Specifically, when we talk about substantial gainful activity, we're looking at basically dollars and cents. It equates to earnings that are received for performing work. So somebody to be engaging in SGA, they have to actually physically be going to work every single day. For the current calendar year that we're in, SGA for non-blind individuals is $1,090, and for blind individuals, it's $1,820. Since we're close to the end of the year, I figured I would share calendar year 16's gainful activity. SGA for non-blind individuals is $1,130, and means $1,820 for individuals that are blind. So that gives you a little information about SGA. Medically determinable impairment, what we're doing here at the Maryland Disabilities, we're looking for a diagnosis or signs and symptoms that will lead us to a diagnosis. And we have to have what we call an MDI to be able to make that medical determination. Without that, we don't have anything to base that determination on medically. So that's really key when we're adjudicating claims here. Finally, duration. That's really important. So we're looking at individuals that are unable to work and have that medically determinable impairment. The individual has to be for an extended period of time, at least 12 months. Or if an incident occurs, we here at the DDS have to determine if this impairment and degree of limitation that's imposed on this impairment would last for at least 12 consecutive months. So those SGA, medically determinable impairment, and duration are very key when we're looking at the definition of disability. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call our sequential evaluation process. And really, these 5 steps kind of encompass how we walk through making a medical determination. Now, in the definition of disability, talked about SGA. If someone is engaging in SGA and during a pertinent period, we have to make a medical determination. So if somebody is working and during a time where we would be looking to find them disabled, we would likely return that claim back to the field office where they originally filed. So we would never even consider medical or vocational factors in this instance. However, if they're working and they're making under that SGA threshold, we will continue to adjudicate the claim here at the Maryland DDS, and nationwide at other state DDSs, they would also continue to adjudicate the claim. Step sequential evaluation, if somebody is making under SGA, we're going to look at what we call impairment severity. So an individual have a medically determinable impairment that is severe enough to preclude them from performing SGA. And when we talk about severity, when somebody with a severe impairment, it must limit their ability to perform basic activities. And specifically for adults, we really look at activities that relate to work-related tasks. A non-severe impairment no more than a minimal effect on the individual's ability to perform basic activity. And again, this relates both to physical and mental limitations. So, for example, someone that may have had a loss of consciousness and have any significant residual impact and are without significant functional deficits and are able to basically take care of their basic needs, might be able to take care of others, socialization is good, we might consider that individual to have a not severe impairment. So if he does have a severe impairment which significantly limits their ability to perform basic activities, so maybe someone had some sort of loss of consciousness and it does significantly impact them, we would say that the person has a severe impairment. We would jump to step 3 of sequential evaluation. At step 3 of sequential evaluation, we look at, does the individual have an impairment which meets or equals the listing? We talk about whether an impairment meets a listing, and we're going to actually go through the listings that we use at DDSs to guide us in making a determination for traumatic brain injuries. And very specific criteria identified in what we call the medical listings, and that criteria has to be established, again, through the medical records that we're obtaining. For some equal a listing, if their set of symptoms, signs, and laboratory findings in the medical evidence are found to be equivalent to the listings, then we could possibly equal someone. I'm not going to go into more detail at this point. In a couple slides, I'm actually going to go through the listings. And in our online resources at the end, I've actually provided a hyperlink for everybody to be able to go to the Social Security website directly to the medical listings. However, if someone is found to meet or equal the listing, this is the first point of sequential evaluation where we can find someone disabled and that they meet the criteria for Social Security disability. If someone is found that they don't meet or equal the listings, we'll still continue to adjudicate their claim, but what we're going to do at this point is look at what residual capacity do these individuals retain. So first, which is the 4th step of sequential evaluation, we're looking at, does the impairment preclude the ability for this individual to perform past relevant work? Now, going and looking at their work, what happens is the disability examiners that work at the state agencies provide a summary to our medical and psychiatric consultants here at the state DDSs, and they will work together in making what's called a residual functional capacity. So we actually have what we call an RFC, residual functional capacity, for physical complaints. And under those physical complaints, we're really looking at exertional limitations, lifting, carrying, and walking and standing. We're looking at postural limitations, falling and crouching and balancing and kneeling. We're also looking at manipulative limitations, basically gross and fine motor movement, sensation with feeling in their fingers, visual limitations, their ability to communicate, any environmental limitations. So those are things that we look for when we're being for the medical side, for physical impairments. We're looking at mental residual functional capacity. The psychiatrists and psychologists that work here look at an individual's ability to understand, their memory to retain information. Do they have sustained concentration and persistence? What's their social interaction like? How do they adapt to certain situations? It's all information. We're looking at the medical evidence, and we're creating these residual functional capacities, and we're looking at, again, as I said before, what capabilities do these individuals retain? And go back to their past work, we use this residual functional capacity. Every individual that files for Social Security, we require a 15-year work history. So we look at past work history, and we look at what their residual functional capacity indicates that they're capable of doing. Based on that, can these individuals return to past work? In regard to past work, they had to have done it long enough to be able to retain the skills to jobs. So we're only going to identify what we call past relevant work. And if we find that they go back to their past work, an individual would be denied at step 4 of sequential evaluation. If we find that they cannot return to their past relevant work, we're going to go to step 5 of sequential evaluation and determine, does the impairment preclude the ability for the individual to perform other work? Looking at other work, we really, in addition to the RFC, we look at how old is the individual, what type of education do they have, what is their past work, what are their transferability of skills, and we identify other types of work that these individuals could return to within the national economy. Here we are tasked to identify at least 3 jobs. If we're unable to identify at least 3 jobs, we would make a determination of disability based on what we consider medical and vocational factors, and the individual would be found disabled. If we're able to identify jobs that the individual can return to, an individual would be denied at step 5 of sequential evaluation. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluation of traumatic brain injury. Dr. Sarno, the first one talks about the neurologic and mental impairments and how there's such a wide variety of post-traumatic symptoms and signs. And I'm not going to touch on that too much because that's really what Carla's presentation is about. One of the things that we felt was really important was the recovery aspect of a TBI. Understanding the community and clients that the folks that are involved in SOAR are working with. You may often be involved with somebody as soon as they have some sort of traumatic brain injury, and you might even be working with someone that has TBI but maybe has never even been diagnosed with a TBI. So some of the things that we share today give you some really good triggers when you're dealing with certain individuals. But for us, for adjudicating a claim at the state DDS, if it's a claim that's assigned to us with a recent TBI, there's such a high variability for recovery that we try not to make the determination as soon as we get the claim. Oftentimes, we will see significant improvement, or even after significant improvement, there might be a worsening. So generally, if somebody has a neurological impairment, they might stabilize more quickly than someone with a mental impairment, but at the same time, they could possibly worsen over time. So we tend to here do something that's called a medical hold. And for individuals with traumatic brain injury, we can put that claim on medical hold for up to 3 to 6 months. Now that's 3 to 6 months status post the injury, not 3 to 6 months from we get the actual claim. We really want to determine if there's been any type of stabilization. And we don't want to miss someone that has shown improvement who could actually decline after a handful of months. Another thing that's really key there is we often perform consultative evaluations if they're needed here at the DDS. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what a consultative examination is, we would, if we need additional information and we're unable to get it from a community provider, we could send someone out for a consultative exam. If needed some sort of psychological testing, we wouldn't do that here until 6 months post the TBI. We want to make sure that we're getting the right information and determine, their limitations after that 6-month period. I'm going to go over the listings. This information is available to the general public, and as I said, there is a hyperlink to our medical listings. Traumatic brain injury is actually, you can see listing of impairments. It's under our 1100 neurological listings specifically for adults, and under 1118 under cerebral trauma. So for physical impairments, we're looking at 2 specific areas with regard to cerebral trauma. And what happens is in 1118, if you go and you look up that list, it actually refers you to listing 1102, 1103, 1104, and 1202. Right now I'm going to talk about 1102, 1103, and 1104 very briefly. 1102 and 1103 specifically address epilepsy, and what we're looking for individuals that may have any type of epilepsy, seizure disorder, we're looking at the 2 different kinds, convulsive and non-convulsive epilepsy. We're looking for similar information. We like detailed descriptions of typical seizure patterns. Some folks that have epilepsy will keep diaries of when they have their seizures, how long they last, what happens during the seizure. They get descriptions from friends that are with them. That's always important to add what happened during the event. We look for the listing specifically. We look for someone to meet the listing. The epilepsy would have to be more frequently than 1 time a month and have to continue to occur despite prescribed treatment of at least 3 months. So that's specific to 1102 and 1103 for epilepsy. Other way we evaluate traumatic brain injuries physically is through what we call central nervous system vascular accidents. Here we're specifically looking at sensor motor aphasia, and sensor aphasia is receptive, individuals understanding what somebody is sharing with them, or motor aphasia is expressive, an individual's ability to share information. And then the other way we adjudicate 1104 is by looking at motor function. There must be significant and persistent disorganization of motor function in 2 extremities, resulting in sustained disturbance of gross and dexterous movement or gait and station. So if somebody had some sort of traumatic brain injury and it impacted on their left side, they would have the significant problems with their right upper extremity or their right lower extremity. So if there's significant disorganization of motor function in their right leg and their right arm, where they might need a walker or they wouldn't be able to use their hand, those are the types of things that we would be looking at. So that's physical. I'm going to touch on that because a lot of the individuals that we work with SOAR have mental impairments, but oftentimes they do have occurring physical problems as well, and individuals with TBIs often have some physical limitations. So move forward, I'm going to briefly talk about the mental listing, and then Carla's going to get into really the nuts and bolts of the actual symptoms and signs and causes. As I mentioned earlier, 1118, cerebral trauma, refers specifically for mental to 1202, which is organic mental disorders. I'm not going to go through and read the specific listing, but what I'm going to do is jump to the next slide. But this is a specific listing of what we're looking for, and you can see the second bullet is about a level of severity for these disorders, and it refers to A and B criteria as well as C criteria, and that's what I'm going to go through right now. So as I mentioned earlier when I was talking through sequential evaluation and the listing, have specific criteria that must be met for a person to meet the listing. So when we're looking at the 1202 mental health, organic mental disorders for someone with a traumatic brain injury, they meet at least one of the following under A, and it's a demonstration of a loss of specific cognitive abilities or effective changes in the medically documented persistence of at least one of the following: disorientation to time and place, memory impairment, either short-term, immediate, or long-term, perceptual or thinking disturbances, change in personality, disturbance in mood, emotional ability, and impairment in impulse control, or loss of measured intellectual ability of at least 15 IQ points from pre-morbid levels or overall impairment index clearly within the severely impaired range of neuropsychological testing. Now, the last one we find difficult at times because a lot of individuals won't have testing prior to their traumatic brain injury. For the specific criteria, and they must have at least one of those, and it must be documented medically, and it must be persistent. However, in addition to the A criteria, they must also have the B criteria. And B criteria is resulting at least two of the following, and this is really where function comes into play. So, individual must have marked restriction of activities of daily living, or restriction in maintaining their social functioning, marked difficulties in maintaining concentration, persistence, or pace, or repeated episodes of decompensation, each of an extended duration. In addition to one of the A criteria, they must also have at least two marked restrictions in four of the functional areas: ADL, social functioning, concentration, persistence, and pace, or the episodes of decompensation. However, is writing me notes furiously over here. If somebody has an extreme limitation in one of the B criteria, that would override for two of a marked limitation. Okay. Now, one other area, the C criteria. This would stand alone by itself. So A and B are together, and C, we can find information medically documenting a history of a chronic organic mental disorder of at least a 2-year duration that has caused more than a minimal limitation of an individual's ability to do basic work, with symptoms or signs currently attenuated by medication or psychosocial support, and one of the following: repeated episodes of decompensation, a residual disease process that has resulted in such marginal adjustment that even a minimal increase in mental demands or change in the environment would be predicted to cause the individual to decompensate, or a current history of 1 or more years' inability to function outside a highly supportive living arrangement with an indication of continued need for such an arrangement. So those are usually individuals that might be in some sort of long-term treatment, maybe hospitalization, home. They would fall under the C criteria. So those are the things in a nutshell, and I'm going to turn it over to Carla, and she's going to review from a clinical perspective traumatic brain injury symptoms, causes, and associated problems and impairments.
Okay, let me say hello to everybody out there. I'm going to give you a very quick background as to who I am. I've been with the Maryland DDS going on now almost 17 years. I'm board certified in adult psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry, but we're going to focus primarily on signs and symptoms with adults in this particular presentation. So the first thing is, what is a TBI? And a TBI can be caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or a penetrating injury that disrupts the normal function of the brain. Not all blows or jolts to the head result in a traumatic brain injury. Severity of a traumatic brain injury can range from mild, that is a brief change in mental status or loss of very brief consciousness, to severe, for example, an extended period of unconsciousness or amnesia after the injury. There are types of severe traumatic brain injury that we're going to talk about briefly: a closed versus a penetrating head injury. A closed head injury to the brain can be caused by movement of the brain within the skull, caused by anything such as a fall, a motor vehicle accident, or being struck by an object, such as to the brick head. And a penetrating head injury is caused by a foreign object entering the skull. Could include a firearm, such as a bullet, or subject to a sharp object penetrating the brain. Okay, so let's talk about first the mild traumatic brain injury symptoms. Physical symptoms of a mild TBI can be a very brief loss of consciousness, few seconds to few minutes, a sensation of feeling dazed, confused, or disoriented. There's no, again, loss of consciousness is LOC, loss of consciousness. You can have a headache, nausea or vomiting can occur. You can have some fatigue or drowsiness, difficulty falling asleep or sleeping more than usual, and dizziness or loss of balance. This can range from, I don't know, lasting from a day up to several days to several weeks. You also can have the sensation of blurred vision in the ears, taste in the mouth, changes in ability to smell, sensitivity to light or sound. And you have also, with a mild traumatic brain injury, some cognitive deficits such as memory or concentration problems, mood changes or swings, and feeling depressed or anxious for several weeks. How to translate into functioning? Normal tasks usually will take longer to complete. There might be errors in routine mistakes. Think is easily distracted, so you can't be around like TV monitors or in other conversations or have cell phones by you because you will lose your train of thought. You could have, again, difficulty multitasking and take you a longer time to get organized. Let's see what else we can say about this. You can have some difficulty with behavior disinhibition, even with a mild TBI. Again, it's a matter of extremes, and it's how long it lasts. Usually a mild TBI can last anywhere from a day or two to several weeks. Okay. Moderate to severe TBI usually include the following physical symptoms: loss of consciousness for several minutes to hours, persistent headache or headache that worsens over time, repeated vomiting or nausea, can result in convulsions or seizures, dilation of one pupil or of both pupils, fluid draining from the nose or ears. The fluid would typically be cerebral spinal fluid, inability to awaken from sleep. You really have a very difficult time arousing somebody. Weakness or numbness in fingers and toes, and loss of coordination would be the physical manifestation. You also have cognitive or mental symptoms: profound confusion, agitation, combativeness, or other unusual behavior, slurred speech, or coma, and other disorders of consciousness. Again, functional manifestation would be you cannot do multitasks, you're easily distracted, difficulty holding new information, and certainly having difficulty recalling phone numbers, addresses, which should be readily available to you. Things take much longer. You can't do calculations. You abandon, or an individual will abandon complex projects. They need to focus on one thing at a time. Need to rely on others to plan activities or make decisions for them, typically managing money or getting them via transportation, public transportation, or getting them transportation to wherever they need to go. They cannot find an exit out of the building. They easily get lost. They repeat themselves in conversations, or they might have difficulty in their language, and that would manifest itself by having, it's called word anomia. They have difficulty trying to, like I'm right now, having difficulty finding the word to express themselves. They will say such things as, you know, that thing over there. Instead of saying, oh yes, give me the pencil, they'll say, give me that thing. You know what I mean. They'll say that a lot. They use pronouns, he, she, instead of names because they can't remember the names of people, or they'll have odd word usage. They'll have difficulty using tools which they normally use. Behavior, again, it's very difficult difficult in SOAR claimants who are typically homeless individuals, have no treatment, might be complicated by substance use and psychiatric conditions. Behavior can manifest itself in many, many different ways. Their emotional reactions to very benign situation can be exaggerated, overdrawn, very emotional, labile. They can be aggressive. They can be socially insensitive and make very inappropriate sexual comments or remarks. They have no regard for safety. They have difficulty responding to boundaries and limits. Okay. We briefly talked about causes of TBI. TBI, as I said, is caused by a blow or other traumatic injury to the head or body. The degree of damage can depend on several factors, including the nature of the event and the force of the impact. This is very important when we start to talk about IED or blasts, injuries that are caused by blasts. As we've seen many cases from Afghanistan and Iraq. Damage to brain cells may be limited to the area directly below the point of impact on the skull, and a severe blow or jolt could cause multiple points of damage because the brain may move back and forth in the skull. Okay. So causes, again, of TBI can be a severe rotational or spinning jolt that causes tearing of the brain cells. A blast is from an explosive device, which we've seen from veterans, can cause widespread damage. And the problem with IEDs is that if an Army or a military personnel are stuck in a building and a blast goes off in the building, it's not just the one blast, it's what are called multiple blast effects, because the blast bounces off of one wall to the second wall to the third wall. So they just don't have one blast exposure, and one blast exposure it can be compounded. Which is, again, is exposed to many of those, it can have its toll. An object penetrating the skull can cause severe irreparable damage to the brain, blood cells, and protective tissues around the brain, the meninges. Bleeding in and around the brain, swelling and blood clots can also disrupt oxygen supply to the brain and cause wide damage. So intellectual problems, many people who have had a significant brain injury will experience changes in their thinking. Traumatic brain injury can result in problems with many skills, such as being able to do calculations, recall things, learn new things, how they reason on their feet, their processing speed. That is a big one. Individuals with on our RFCs, well, particularly on the MRFCs on the psychiatric side, we have multiple questions that key out persistence, pace, and concentration, and they focus specifically on, can somebody work an 8-hour day, 5 days a week without having multiple interruptions, or can they get through a day and work at a reasonable pace? And with traumatic brain injury, these individuals, the more severe it is, their executive functioning goes out the door, and it takes them so much longer to do something that used to be very simple for them. Their judgment goes out the door, and again, attention and concentration is impacted. Okay. Again, it's some of the same things that we've already talked about. Organizational skills, processing speed are out the door, and we really have to do or would like psychological testing, because some of it, it's like a shade of gray. You really have to sometimes go for the testing to are they in the borderline range, or is it really more severe than that? Because some of these individuals can compensate for themselves on some level, but when it comes to learning new information, they really have a difficult time. So language, one of the things you'll see with language when you might be interviewing these claimants is their speech is dysarthric or sounds slurred or impaired. Again, you have to make sure they're not intoxicated or smelling of alcohol or using drugs, but at the same time, there's a very definite, very clear sense. If you've seen somebody who's dysarthric and have sat with people who have language processing problems, you will know exactly what you have when you see it. They might have difficulty writing. They can't write words like they used to. They've graduated high school or college, and these individuals no longer can fill out the forms. They have trouble following conversations and turn to the person that they're with to fill in the blanks. Continuing with communication problems, trouble learning, taking turns in a conversation, problems with changes in tone, pitch, or emphasis to express emotions. Sometimes they might appear very flat. You see that sometimes with chronic schizophrenics with negative symptoms. They have a very flat affect, very monotone speech, very sparse speech. You see that also in traumatic brain injury patients. Trouble reading cues from listeners. They can't interpret facial or body expressions. They have difficulty starting or stopping conversations and inability to use the muscles needed to form words. We talked about that dysarthria. Again, the next slide is behavioral changes, difficulty with self-control, lack of awareness of their abilities, they're engaging in risky behaviors, inaccurate self-image, difficulty in social situations, very inappropriate expressions or conversations, and they all of a sudden, what's called like an intermittent explosive disorder, be very physically aggressive, verbally aggressive, and sometimes individuals have no recollection of the behavior that they just demonstrated. Okay. Individuals who have, say, moderate traumatic brain injury, they're clearly aware on some level that they're not functioning as they used to, and then they're subject to depression, anxiety, swings. Sometimes they, because of the injury, can no longer express empathy. Their anger is very prevalent, and they have difficulties in sleeping. We're just talking here about some of the problems, sensory problems. They might complain of tinnitus or ringing in the ears, difficult recognizing objects. I said, what's that? I want that thing over there, as opposed to saying I want that pencil. Impaired hand-eye coordination. They might complain of blind spots or double vision. They might complain of a bitter taste or a bad smell or difficulty smelling, which should not be confused with a delusional disorder. When you have somebody who is delusional, will often say that they have a bad odor that emanates from them, regardless of how many times they take a shower or a bath. Individuals with TBI might complain of skin tingling, pain or itching, trouble with balance or dizziness. Okay. So degenerative brain diseases, a traumatic injury, can increase the risk of one to develop Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and we know the dementia pugilistica, which is as a result of prize fighters who have been repeatedly beaten over the head or hit or struck in the face. We're getting to see that also with pro football players. Despite helmets, they still are starting to develop pretty significant traumatic brain injury. So Alzheimer's, the primary problem is progressive loss of memory. Parkinson's, which is a movement disorder such as tremors, rigidity, slow movement. Parkinson's sometimes can be very difficult to treat because the medication that you use for Parkinson's disease can include or increase dopamine production. And some of those individuals go on to develop hallucinations. And what I call the neurologist to come in. And dementia as a result of being hit by a prize fighter, most often associated with repeated blows. We know that's in boxing and also in like football players. Okay, so some of the medical evidence of the records that you're going to see in the MIR that you're going to see, you're going to see something called a Glasgow Coma Scale. And a Glasgow Coma Scale is what's used initially to rate somebody when they first come into a trauma unit or an emergency room. And it's usually based on three areas. Your best eye-opening response. Are they opening their eyes when you ask them to? Do they respond to pain? Do they open their eyes when you pinch them? Do they speak spontaneously? And then best motor response, is there any response? Do they respond again when you pinch them, and are they verbally responding? So the scales go from basically 0, you're dead at 0, to 15, you're fine. So mild TBI can be sometimes in between 13 to 15, moderate can be 9 to 12, severe TBI is 3 to 8. And I look for this when I get records from somebody who tells me they've had a TBI. I'll look at the Glasgow Coma Scale to see if there usually should be one. If there is truly evidence that they've had a TBI, this should have been done. And I look for the information regarding the type of injury and the symptoms they manifested. We can actually allow somebody at the 3 months after their TBI if they're pretty severe and there's no chance of them getting better. If they seem to be improving, then as Caroline said, we wait and hold the record for 6 months to see that they've maintained their improvement, and then we will get testing at that point. And usually the testing that we do through the Department of Disability is the WACE. That's the Wechsler Adult Test, and it's spelled WECHSLER. And we also do the Wechsler Memory Scale. We're now currently on the WACE 4 and the WIMS 4. And we also do the RAT4, which is a cursory educational level. But you often find evidence that you get as a SOAR rep from trauma units from like University of Maryland Shock Trauma or from Hopkins and where you are located. You'll see that they've done neuropsychological testing, but it includes like bits and pieces of different types of testing from all sorts of tests. And the reason why they're doing that is they're trying to locate the exact lesion or where the lesions are in the brain. And we kind of do an overall IQ test and memory test, and if we don't have any kind of current testing in file, or we'll use what the trauma centers have come up with. We tend to make our decisions based on the symptoms, how they're presenting, the ADLs, and what the tests show. Also look to see if there's any kind of MRI, CT scan, or EEG in the file, and sometimes we'll also see that they've measured intracranial pressure because of the trauma. You might have an increase in the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so that's all that I have right now.
All right, real briefly, and we probably went over a little bit, our apologies. We have a lot of information to share. Just wanted to show you the online resources. I mentioned the listings. This is the listings link, Social Security's overall website, publications, which are really great if you want to share those with your clients, and then our Maryland State DDS website. I'm going to turn it over. I'm certain they have Stacia on the line.
Caroline, before we turn it over, we wanted to ask Dr. Sarno a question since we had 2 attendees ask the same question. So, Dr. Sarno, the question is, would a stroke constitute a TBI?
Now, look at this very differently here. A stroke is looked at very differently. We look at somebody who has had a bleed, an internal bleed or a stroke. We look at them after 3 months. So if I want to get psychological testing on somebody who's complained of a stroke, we usually get testing, psychological testing, the WACE and the WIMS, because they're complaining of memory problems after 3 months from when they had the stroke. TBI is something exogenous, outside of themselves, whereas the stroke is internal. We look at them very differently.
Now, if I can add, when I was going through the listing, I don't remember what slide number. Actually, I do have what slide number it is. It's slide number 41? No, 42. Is I reviewed the medical listings. 1104 is how we would evaluate cerebral trauma if somebody had a cerebrovascular accident. So the first thing that we would usually, depending on what their complaints when they file, we're going to look at, is there the aphasia, receptive or expressive, that I discussed earlier, or is there the disorganization of their motor functioning?
I want to just jump in here. If the medical side cannot allow or meet somebody on an 1104 because of the CVA, the default is to send them over to the psych side for testing, for memory assessment, and we look at them under 1202. So that goes for everything. I mean, we end up seeing a lot of the TBI cases because claimants don't actually meet the physical limits on the medical side, so we end up seeing quite a few of these cases.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarno. Now we would like to reintroduce Stacia Edson, who we do have back on phone hookup. So, Stacia, are you with us now?
I hopefully am.
Yes, we can hear you, and so can everyone else. Thank you so much for hanging in there. We got your slides, so ready to go.
I really want to thank everybody for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. And I actually think things shook out is going to be to our benefit, because I think now you have a good understanding of kind of the nuts and bolts of what brain injury means in terms of areas of functioning, problems that people have. And can I go back to my slides? Well, I'm assuming those slides are coming up in a minute.
One second,
okay,
Stacia, we're getting your slides up.
Okay, so I'm going to just say that you've already had a good definition of traumatic brain injury, and we've touched upon stroke, which is an acquired brain injury, but I want to say that both of those disabling conditions, we believe, those of us in the world of brain injury, believe they accelerate aging. And that really has been something that's been validated by a recent study, 2014, in the Journal of Neurotrauma. And so for people who are working with individuals who may be living with a history of brain injury, it doesn't matter if that brain injury happened years ago. Folks who have had a history of brain injury with at least one night in the hospital, just one night, have a decreased life expectancy on average of 9 years. So it really does rob people of a fuller life that they might have had they not had that brain injury. People with traumatic brain injury oftentimes have to take medications for, say, a seizure disorder, and long-term use of medications, as I'm sure a doctor could confirm, is kind of hard on some folks' liver. And so we see people as they age with brain injury having trouble medically and physically. And the other thing is that you may see folks who seemingly are doing fine or did fine after a pretty significant brain injury, and they come to you, maybe your attention 5 to 10 years post-injury, because now they're not doing so well. They've lost a lot of jobs. They're not able to function the way that they want to. And so I've worked with people, I've been in this field for a long time, and I know folks who went back to work initially and did fine, and then one woman I can think of 10 years post-injury had to leave work, and she applied for disability, and it was granted. So disability from brain injury really can age people. I want to belabor statistics. There's a lot of people who are counted by the Centers of Disease Control. We expect about 1.7 million that are counted. We believe there's many more people who are not counted. And we lose about 50,000 people a year who die of traumatic brain injury. So this is a pretty significant public health issue. The most common cause of brain injury is falls. This is among our young children and our elderly. And it depends on where you live, what part of the country. I worked in Baltimore City for many years, and assault. Naturally, only 10% of brain injuries occur from assault, but at the program I worked at, it was assault. That's how individuals received their traumatic brain injury. So we have a traumatic brain injury. Folks who are incarcerated, there's a high rate of individuals living within our correctional facilities. About 50% of folks who are incarcerated in this country have a history of brain injury. For those who are experiencing homelessness, about 90%, according to the studies. Perpetrators and victims of domestic violence. So I'm going to go and talk about each one of those in a little bit more detail. So the folks up in Canada, so the Canadian Medical Journal has published several articles over the years, most recently in 2014, talking about the brain injury and homelessness connection. And so the individuals that they screened in that 2008 study, they had about 900 people that they were able to screen, and there was a lifetime prevalence of 53%. Of those individuals, 12% had a moderate to severe brain injury, which meant they lost consciousness for up to 24 hours. That's a pretty significant injury, one that would lead them, I imagine, to be hospitalized at least for one night. And 14, they also found a pretty high rate of homelessness. And if you note, the majority of those brain injuries occurred before people became homeless. So there's a connection between the brain injury, perhaps, and being able to navigate society, work, the community in order to maintain housing and maintain employment. And if that becomes impaired due to a brain injury, then people are going to find themselves at risk of homelessness. If you're interested, those people who really research, the articles are online at the National Institutes of Health PubMed Library. It makes for pretty fascinating reading if you're interested in the details. And this is our veterans. There's a connection between homelessness, brain injury, and our veterans. If you want more information on the incidence of brain injury among our service members, we certainly encourage you to go to the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center website. But just generally speaking, brain injury was a signature wound of the in Afghanistan and Iraq. However, it is important to note that most brain injuries incurred by our service members occur in non-combat situations. Doesn't mean it's any less important, but a lot of people get a head injury either during training practice exercises or say if they're off base and driving. So a study in 2015, this is really hot off the press, of 229 veterans seeking homeless services, nearly all had sustained at least one traumatic brain injury prior to the first episode of homelessness. So again, the brain injury impairs people's ability to navigate what's expected of them in their adult life. And this is a study that's a few years old, but I always include it because it really speaks to what we call the hidden brain injuries. So people who are living in our communities who may on the surface look like they're functioning just fine, but they're having some problems in their lives. And if you peel back the onion, that problem may be related to a history of brain injury. So Dr. Silver at NYU sent a bunch of epidemiology grad students into New Haven, Connecticut, and they were able to interview 5,000 people. And of those people, a good number of them but recalled a blow to the head with unconsciousness or a period of confusion. And if you remember the discussion, mild brain injury and moderate brain injury, a mild brain injury is still a brain injury. And when folks agreed who had on screening to have some history of brain injury, but they agreed to some or testing, they found these individuals had twice the rate of depression, drug and alcohol abuse. So brain injury, depression, and substance use are the trifecta, and we see it so often in the population in all situations who have these three things going on. Elevated rates of panic and obsessive compulsive disorder. And regarding the the obsessive compulsive disorder, Dr. Paul Clellan, he's here in Maryland, he talks about that disorder, which is viewed as a psychiatric condition, as possibly accrued to a history of brain injury. So is a person really OCD and the clinical definition, sense of the word, or is that person living with a memory problem, injury or brain injuries that causes them to, review, did I turn off the coffee pot? Did I lock the door? So they're compensating for a memory problem, but it can look to an outside observer as if they have the obsessive compulsive disorder. So the thing I want to talk about is a study that was done in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's actually still going on. This is, I think, something I would like everybody to, if you remember nothing from what I've said at the end of the day, remember this phrase: people grow into their brain injuries. They grow into their brain injuries. And that's something that Dr. Jerry Joya, he's a pediatric neuropsychologist here in Maryland, said years ago, and has stayed in my brain, and I see the new studies coming out that really support that statement. So this is the Christchurch birth cohort, and these individuals have been followed since the 70s. They're in their late 30s. And they were followed for a number of things. They came from lower socioeconomic families in Christchurch. And so a very eagle-eyed grad student, Dr. McKinley, before she finished her studies, noticed that a lot of these kids were being admitted to hospital with brain injuries. And so she started looking at the number of brain injuries of this cohort. So they're looking at them for socioeconomic issues, developmental disability issues, school issues, family and parental mental health and substance abuse issues. And so she noted this brain injury trend, and so they started following these young people. Found they had a brain injury as a young child. If they had a brain injury, even a mild one that resulted in at least one night in hospital, these kids were more likely, as they reached adulthood, to develop a substance use-related disorder or to have involvement with law enforcement. So go back to what I said about growing into brain injury. So you're not going to see a 5-year-old, having it out with an officer of the law. But what happens is our children, and if you are around kids, if you have kids and you were once a child, you know how structured the environment is naturally for kids. The school is structured, activities are structured. You really don't leave your parents or an adult site until you hit middle school. So a child has an early brain injury. They usually get pretty good rehabilitation, and then they have this already innate structure in the environment. And they do fine, say, until they hit middle school, and then structure naturally falls away. But that child is growing into, say, a frontal lobe injury. So the injury to the front part of the brain that uses our executive skills, our ability to make decisions, our ability to weigh options, our ability to keep our thoughts to ourselves when we shouldn't say something, to keep our hands to ourselves, all those things that we as adults learn over time. But if you had that early brain injury and now you're in a situation where the structure is falling away from you, naturally we expect that frontal lobe of that 9 to 11-year-old to step up to the plate, but it cannot. So I'm now, had 2 years past my brain injury, did okay with some supports in elementary school, and now I'm in middle school. It's a big school. There's 3 different locker combinations. I have 7 notebooks to keep track of, and all these new faces. It's much bigger than my elementary school, and gee, I'm having trouble concentrating. I'm having trouble organizing my work. But I don't say, sorry, Vice Principal, who I've been sent to for the 3rd time this week because I can't keep my mouth shut in class, or mouthing off to the teacher. I don't say, well, I had a brain injury and my executive lobe's been affected and now I can't, inhibit my remarks. No, that child may be labeled as something else, ADHD, conduct disorder. We see all these things. And then, just following that line of the growing into brain injury, the child goes into high school, and that's where we see the substance use kind of come into play, and they can't keep up with their peers, or they can't keep up with the peers maybe they expected to keep up with. So, these are the kids that as they age may be very vulnerable to drug and alcohol use and also to interaction with law enforcement. And, we see this over again when we talk to family members. He was such a good kid until he fell off the bike, until he was in that car accident. So that leads me to why is it so important for us to screen for a history of traumatic brain injury? And in my perfect world, everybody who works in human services ask the questions of folks that they are working with. Have you had a history of brain injury? And the way to do it is to use the screening tool, which you all should have access to, the Ohio State University TBI identification method. It's important to screen for brain injury because oftentimes people are unaware of how a prior history is going to impact on their ability to manage work, school, community relationships with others. So that a child who had that brain injury at 5 is now 18, he doesn't know why he gets bored at work and he can't initiate the next step. He doesn't know why he tells his boss to take a flying leap. Things come out of his mouth before he can stop it. People are saying, oh, he's just having a rough adolescence, but that's all it is. And what will happen is people have difficulty accessing and participating in and benefiting from mental health and or substance abuse services. So these are the folks who may not be able to follow the instructions. So, Sam, I want you to come back to my office on Monday, bring me your birth certificate or proof of address, and we'll fill out this paperwork. And the person comes back the next day, and you say, where's the paperwork? And they say, what paperwork? It happens a few times, and people may think that they're not really invested, that they are just playing you, that we've heard all kinds of things, that this person is being disinterested and is not making good use of the opportunities for them in treatment, and so you discharge them for noncompliance. And this does happen quite a bit in mental health programs and in substance abuse programs if the professionals are not aware that this person needs some assistance in becoming engaged in services. So if this person's having a brain injury, they have this memory issue, they're not going to remember something you tell them verbally, but maybe they will if you write it down for them. So I hope I'll have a chance to pull up the ID because I reference it. But if you don't have it, that's fine. It's there for you to look at later. This is Dr. Gordon. He's at one of our model system programs, and they're the groups of medical professionals around the country that are doing research in this area. And identified traumatic brain injury is an unrecognized major source of social and vocational failure. I believe this to be true, and I think, given what we've already heard this afternoon, that you can see why Dr. Gordon feels very strongly about this, that he shared it with the Wall Street Journal a few years back. So I'm not going to go through all this because I think we pretty much understand it. I am going to give you a few clues. So with a visual deficit, somebody might not say to you, I'm having trouble seeing things, I'm having trouble reading, but you maybe want to look for something like an eye patch on one eye. Oftentimes that will be a key to help folks with double vision. The other thing that you may see is another clue you can use is some people may have a prism lens. It looks like a diamond-cut eyeglass lens, and it's called a prism lens, and I'm not sure how exactly the mechanism is that it works, but it also addresses double vision. It can be very common for folks who've had a significant brain injury. And as far as the coordination and the other physical challenges, I just reference you to two people in the public eye who unfortunately very publicly are living with pretty significant residuals from brain injury. And Representative Gabby Giffords is somebody who's living with a gunshot wound, and Tracy Morgan, the comedian, is living with injury from a vehicle accident. And if you watch them in the news, and you can see, Ms. Giffords has trouble with one side of her body. Mr. Jordan has an unsteady gait. And they're very forthcoming about their challenges. And frankly, we really admire them and for educating the public about how brain injury can affect people. So I think we pretty much talked about the thinking. And I just want to say all those thinking issues that have already been covered, the part that's going to interfere with people engaging in services and using services and following through with suggestions and reputation and other strategies is the impairment of executive functioning. And that comes when people have damage to the frontal lobe and temporal tips, because the frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to develop. It doesn't come on board until you're 24, 25. So again, the theme of growing into your brain injury, people didn't realize you were having trouble in fifth grade because you weren't challenged as you would be as a middle schooler, as a high schooler, when we know you consciously or unconsciously that brain is now developed enough to take on bigger challenges. So if you have that impairment in executive skills, you are going to have trouble managing your time, your activities. You're going to have trouble managing interpersonally and socially. So again, growing in brain injury, I often hear from folk rehab counselors who say he's a 10-year-old in a 40-year-old body, and that's what it feels like for somebody who's living with the consequences of brain injury that's affected them in that very critical part of their brain. So key to understanding brain injury for folks who are having trouble with the work of being an adult is the organic damage also impacts behavior and personality. And again, I think a lot of this has been covered. I will just take a moment to give you a few more examples. So the awareness of deficits and how those deficits impact functioning is a major barrier post-traumatic brain injury, and it can contribute to an individual's inability or seeming unwillingness to utilize simple strategies such as writing things down to support their memory if they don't agree they have a memory problem to begin with. I worked with a gentleman who just threw every notebook we tried to give him, every strategy, literally in the trash. He'd been somebody who'd worked all his life, and he was going to work again. I saw him very soon after he was discharged in his workplace, and it was a big hospital. It was very big, a lot of halls, and he was obviously lost. And I walked up to him, and I didn't want to say, I told you so, but I said, hey, how's it going? He burst out laughing, and he said, I got it. So his awareness was not there yet when he was in a rehab program, but it was challenged when he went back to work, and he realized real-life consequences. I'm getting lost. I can't do my job. And so we set him up with a map of his workplace, and he did fine. He's somebody who could learn with repetition, and he did very well, continues to do well as far as I know. So that's just an example, but some folks, they just don't get to that degree of awareness, and that can be a challenge. Sometimes you can have a good relationship with them that they will trust you to coach them. They say, well, I really don't buy what you're selling, but all right, you haven't steered me wrong yet, so okay. And you have that kind of clinical leverage and relationship with people that you can work with them in that way. And oftentimes, if they find it makes their life a little bit easier, they'll start to adopt whatever the recommendations are. The thing I want to point out to you is confabulation. So it looks like making up stories. So people living with a brain injury have big gaps in their memory. And so if you say to someone, hey, how was your morning? And they are sitting in a wheelchair and they're unable to ambulate independently, and they say to you, oh, I got on my bicycle and I rode down the street and got my bagels. And you're thinking, pretty good, isn't it? No, this person is confabulating. You know for a fact that they were in the nurse's station, talking to the nursing staff and having breakfast in the great room. They were not on a bicycle. But because they did not remember, they're filling in the blanks. And that happens for some folks even out of their injury, and it looks like they're lying. It feels like lying. They're not lying. They're trying to save themselves from embarrassment. So they're making up something that sounds pretty plausible. Some folks will get stuck on a conversation. That was called perseveration. That can be socially annoying and off-putting. Anxiety, up there with depression, are the most common problems people have after brain injury. So you want to know these functional clues. They're having trouble doing their basic ADLs. They need reminders for higher level things. They just opened up a can of soup when in the past they've been a gourmet cook. Losing their way. Are they having difficulty making their appointments? Do you notice that they're using any strategies? Are they basically oriented? You want to know, did that individual have trouble as a child? Did they suffer from abuse? Did they have a bad family life? Those kids in the Christchurch cohort, they found if families were given support and told to structure the environment for the child living with a brain injury, the chances of that child having those adverse outcomes, substance use and or legal interaction, of the negative variety, that was mitigated. So that's a helpful message, that people have the right services and supports. They can do very, very well. Does somebody have a history of losing jobs? They could get it, but they can't keep it. Do professionals feel like they're starting from square one? And my colleague at the Brain Injury Association, she and I talk about this. You want to know what the before was. And for some people, if they grew up in that chaotic environment, there may be no clear-cut before. But say if that person was doing okay, despite maybe a major issue with alcohol, they were working, they were maintaining, they were functional, but then they had that fall, and then they had a brain injury, and now they've got trouble. So you can see how it can co-occur. So the TBI ID, the Ohio State Valley Education Program, screening, there is a link on this slide. It will take you to a tutorial. It is only about 20 minutes of your time to go through the tutorial. It combines video and PowerPoint, and it will literally tell you how to conduct the screening. And the screening usually takes 5 to 10 minutes. It's quick. The key is you don't say to somebody, hey, have you had a brain injury? Have you had a head injury? Have you hurt your head? Because most folks will get their backs up. We're saying, because there's a lot of stigma. So you want to know. You're going to say to them, I'm going to ask you a few questions in your lifetime. This is a question, have you ever been hospitalized or treated in an emergency room following an injury to your head or neck? So you're asking them questions about circumstances where they may have had a brain injury. So I really encourage you to do that. What you're looking for in the OSU TBI ID, once you've completed it, is you're looking for a worse brain injury where it was more than 30 minutes of loss of consciousness. You're looking for the age, that first. Was it before the age of 15? Did they have multiple brain injuries? And we talk about people living with a history of service, time in service, who may have been exposed to IED blasts, people who were in domestic violence situations, people who were victims of childhood abuse, people who played sports. So you have multiple brain injuries, especially close together. That's another clue. Was injury recent? Is there a recent hit to the head? People oftentimes have depression and pretty significant attention issues. So by the end of doing the screening, you should know what the worst, the first, multiple, and recent. If you know that there were some other ways that brain was injured, that's going to give you some more information about how that person may be impacted functionally. So I cannot recommend that enough. And also, I cannot recommend listening to this webinar, and there's a link to that, and it's an hour. It talks about the behavioral health consequences of brain injury. It talks also about the ID, TBI ID, and how to use it. You know, we've already heard a lot about how to get that supporting documentation. And sometimes, you know, with the folks that I've worked with over years, there's not an opportunity to get that full neuropsychological evaluation. Sometimes it's a financial issue. Sometimes it's an access issue. But there's some other ways that you can get some good information. You can talk to a speech and language pathologist or an occupational therapist, and they're going to look at language. They're going to look at functional memory, and that can give you some really good information on that person's executive skill functioning. And the last few slides I have here in particular, I wanted to give you some language. So this is an individual who had PTSD and TBI off base, and how the letter was worded so that he was able actually to get 75% rated disability from the VA. So trying to draw a connection between, you know, the person and the functional problems that they're having, and really link it to the brain injury as opposed to a personality disorder, which sometimes you know, people can be labeled as such. And here's some of the tests that's already pretty much been talked about in terms of lecture, but trail making A and B, Wisconsin card sorting are really good for looking at new learning and attention. And those are two things that brain injury can really rob people of. And this is a young woman who had a premorbid issue with drugs and alcohol and had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Then she had a brain injury. So this was just a letter that was written in support of her disability benefit, and she did get benefits. And I have to tell you, this young lady's doing fantastic. She's working. She's got married. She's had a child, and she's going to college. She's had some issues, but she's doing really, really well. And thankfully she had those benefits and she was able to really take care of herself and move forward with her life. So I'm going to stop. Those are some resources. I want to just again urge you to visit the Ohio Valley Brain Injury Center, because not only is the screening there, but then what do you do? Accommodations listed on the website. So I don't know if there's any questions.
Thank you so much. It does look like we are out of time, and we do have a few questions that we will be sure to get answered and get attach a Q&A handout, you know, to the SOAR website, where you'll find the PowerPoint, and the assessment tool that Stacia talked about is also right now on the webinar the SOAR website, where you'll find the webinar. So you'll find that there in addition to the PowerPoint. So I just have time to thank all of our presenters for putting together such detailed slides and sharing not only your experiences, but also reminding us why we do the work we do. So just a quick reminder to please complete the brief online evaluation of today's webinar. And if you do have a question you want to ask, please email that to www.soar.prainc.com, and you can, and you can contact the SOAR TA Center by email at soar@prainc.com, or by phone, area code 518-439-7215. So we'll be sure to direct any questions or comments which cannot be answered today to our presenters for their responses. Again, thank you, and have a great rest of the day.